Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's Christmas Eve today, December 24th, Monday, and I'm sitting down to make a recording, taking a look at today's passage of Mercury in a square to Neptune. And I'm also going to take a follow-up question from, it's actually over the past 3 or 4 weeks, I've gotten a number of questions. They've all been very similar about some of the statements that I've made regarding the idea that we are not our charts, and that the little soapbox issue that I get on about has had a number of interesting responses, and one of them in particular last night made me sort of realize that it would be a good moment to address this in a different way. So I was kind of creatively thinking about it and came up with a pretty good analogy that I think works to help explain why I think this issue is so important. So we'll talk about that as well. But first, let's talk about Mercury and Neptune. So very basically, Mercury is now returning to the exact place that Mercury was located when Mercury turned retrograde last month. So, last month, Mercury turned retrograde in Sagittarius in just about a perfect square with Neptune. And that the entire Mercury retrograde cycle in many ways had to do with issues around clarity and communication. You could say themes like deception and gossip, truth and untruth, lies and distortions. Also, the way that we're able to persuade or convince people of things, or not, based on our logic and our intellect and our communication skills, and what is healthy persuasion and what is unhealthy persuasion. These are all different kind of subtle dimensions of the Mercury Neptune transit in general. And we also had a fire water theme with Mercury in a fire sign in its detriment in Jupiter's sign, whereas Neptune is, in a watery sign like Pisces. So fire water also, a lot of it has to do with water tends to dissolve boundaries. Fire tends to dry things up and create a more separate sense of things, more individualistic, you could say. And so, taking a rigid view on something, but then backing off and losing our center. This happens sometimes when we overcompensate, when we say, "Oh no, I feel kind of weak or uncertain, so I should take a really strong stand," and then we take a really strong stand on something, only to because we've gone too far, become too rigid, we actually make ourselves vulnerable to becoming sort of weak and uncertain and all over the place, and our center can like fade very quickly, and we can basically see that watery Neptune come in and kind of disperse us and spread our energy and our intentions or our sense of focus in many different directions simultaneously. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes we're rigid about something. We're too fixed about something. We've got an idea in our heads. Maybe we haven't thought it over carefully enough. It's just too fiery, kind of too cocksure. And so then Neptune comes in and makes us kind of uncertain about it, makes us question or points out the error in our ways. And suddenly our mojo has, there's a leak in the bucket, and that our mojo has sprung a leak, and we've learned from that. It can be a situation where our certainty, our sense of pride, our sense of strength, especially mentally and verbally, intellectually or philosophically, we're so certain, but then someone comes along, a situation comes along and helps us to realize that maybe we don't know what we're talking about, or maybe there's room for greater humility than we were aware of. And that can be a really positive thing that can come from Neptune, Mercury. On the other hand, there can be that issue where, Neptune, Mercury comes along and tries to deceive people or convince people of things that aren't actually true. My spiritual teacher was here over the weekend, and I got to sort of, sit at his feet and listen to someone who's, it's just very humbling to be in the presence of a monk who's been practicing for a very long time, and just to hear realized, wisdom that's come from that practice. And one of the things that he talked about that I found really interesting was he was talking about a childhood friend of his that he had, and how this childhood friend would always tell him things like, oh, it's like this, or it's like that, or what he would explain things, and he would actually be like, totally bogus and made up. And he would talk about how, it wasn't until he told his dad that his dad would be like, yeah, that guy, that kid's no good, that kid's up to trouble or whatever. And so appealing to a higher source of wisdom or authority that knew more, he was able to identify influences that were coming into his life that were trying to, pull the wool over his eyes. And he just talked about how simple it is that, this day and age, we have so much information and so little time and a lot of laziness around where does the information come from, and is it a reliable source? And also, we also have forgotten in some ways that the most reliable source of the most important kind of information, spiritual information, let's say, really comes from people who are walking and living and embodying the message of spiritual life. It's not to say that it has to be an elder or someone who's really old, but just, in any field, not even just spiritual life, but in any field, in some ways, the culture today is kind of like anyone's an expert. Everyone's got an app on their phone that can, Google and find out information. And so it's very easy, including for myself, to pose ourselves as like great authorities or great experts. And I think it requires a little humility to be like, yeah, there's something I don't know and I need to ask, or I need to look, or I'm uncertain about something, or maybe I said something and I wasn't, I was more confident than I should have been about what I was saying, or like stuff like that can happen. And it can really actually like taking the opportunity to be humble and to search for the source of real knowledge or real wisdom about something in any field, to speak of spiritual life. Just that little bit of check to the pride. It's not fun to do that. But it can help immensely if we find teachers, or we just take a little bit more time to think, do I believe that? What do I really think about that? It's like we have so much information in our lives all the time that coming at us, that we rarely have the time to really think, is that true? How does that feel in my heart? Or, whether it's stuff on the news or everyday conversations or whatever. So it's also a good time to realize that, Mercury Neptune can also represent just kind of the influx of constant information and the way that it changes us or shifts us, and not always in ways that we're conscious of, because we don't always take time to really seek out, where does, maybe first and foremost, how does this feel in my heart? Does it feel true in my heart? And to sit with something, but also just in terms of mundane things, like we don't always know, why we think what we think, or why we do what we do. So another thing that my spiritual teacher was talking about yesterday, and one of the talks that he gave was, he was talking about how, just a very simple thing. And I've heard this since I was a kid growing up in the church as well, that we often go through the motions of holidays, right? Not really understanding why we're doing what we're doing. Why do we celebrate Christmas, really? Or why do we celebrate New Year or Hanukkah or solstice or Yuletide, or, whatever the holiday may be? Sometimes it's like we just slap a meme up, post a shot of us doing something that looks official, but we're really just kind of going through the motions. We're not really taking time to say, why am I doing what I'm doing? And that was my spiritual teacher's point yesterday that I really, really, I loved. In fact, one of the things that he brought up, which is interesting, is there's a pretty strong connection to the suit that Santa Claus wears in our culture here in the United States, at least, and the red and the white of Santa Claus's outfit and the Coca-Cola company and the advertising of the Coca-Cola company. There's a historical relationship between the two that's very strong. I didn't know that. It makes total sense. Like, of course, it's like Coca-Cola's colors, But at any rate, that's beside the point. There are other interesting you can go down a wormhole about, the symbolism of Christmas time. That's not what I'm doing, not what I want to do. But similarly, his point, my spiritual teacher's point, was again just that not understanding the why we're doing something is really important. Or not understanding why we're doing something is not a good thing, because it builds up something in us that in all of our relationships and all in our spiritual life, in our friendships, in our work, contributes to a habit of mindlessness. And that's also kind of a Mercury Neptune theme. Now, speaking of the season of the year, I'm going to read you something. So a lot of times at this time of year, there's obviously many different holidays and religious traditions, and pagan, Christian, Jewish. There's a lot of things going on at this time of year. It's a pretty universal time to celebrate. But one of the greatest, obviously, traditions that we celebrate in the West at this time, that's probably the most popularly celebrated of all of the holidays, is the Christian holiday. And so I'm going to talk about that, not because I'm not aware that there are not other holidays, but because I think it makes a good teaching point for the moment. What is the true meaning of Christmas, right? A lot of people say, when I was a kid, I remember my mom always really, because I was a preacher's kid, right, in the church. So it was always very important. At church, we were always talking about, like, what's the real purpose of this time of year? And it was always like, the birth of Jesus. Of course, Jesus is a very enlightened teacher. Many people around the world, even if they're not Christian per se, really respect and revere the teachings of Jesus. And I think it's very important, though, because at this time of year, a lot of times you end up seeing a lot of sort of cultural and social philosophizing and debating about Jesus, and the esoteric community is always about the Magi and the star and like the mythical meaning of Jesus and just all of this stuff. And I like to bring it back to what we know from the Gospels about what Jesus said was the most important thing. And to me, that's the meaning of Christmas, because if we're going to celebrate, let's say, if anybody's going to celebrate at this time of year, even just, a moment of in your heart, just connecting to the Christ consciousness, if you're going to, then I think the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to connect with what Jesus himself said was the top teaching, or of the utmost importance in spiritual life. This is not the only teaching that's out there. Obviously, I'm qualifying this greatly, so I don't have to deal with all of the all of the stuff. But at any rate, in the book of Matthew, which is often the book that's read at this time of year because of the way that it captures the nativity, which is interesting, if I'm not mistaken. Hold on just a second. So anyway, yeah. So I believe it's Matthew that captures the nativity, but I was going to pull it up and look, but in the book of Matthew, there's a point where his disciples, which are like his students, ask him, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment of them all?" And well, actually not of them all, but specifically in the law. So you have to remember that in most spiritual traditions, whether it's Buddhism or Christianity or different lineages in the yoga tradition, all different places of the world, often there are guidelines for how to practice spiritual life, like rules that are, set forth, and you have to follow them. And so this person says, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Like, what is the greatest, like, thou shalt sort of thing, or thou shalt not, or whatever? Like, what is the greatest requirement? And Jesus's answer is really nice, because it's not really at all legalistic. His answer is, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And to me, that's very, very simple and universal. It's about connecting in the heart with the divine, uh, feeling that sense of having a personal union with something that's bigger than ourselves, that's loving, that's benevolent, that's good, and being in connection with that source, and cultivating that relationship. Um, that is at the center of Jesus's teachings. And then he says, and the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So all of the prophets that come and tell people you've gotten off track, get on track, or that come with special messages, or what we might in astrology consider to be like oracular divinations, like messages from above, giving you some kind of insight or instruction. All of the prophets and all of the law, all of the instructions, the codified ways of doing spiritual life, they all hang on two things that are sort of universal in Jesus's teachings: love God and love one another. And so to me at this time of year, that's what I really take to heart. That's what I try to take a moment to reflect on in the midst of all of the busyness, which is inevitable. And in the midst of different reasons that we have for celebrating this time of year. Clearly, this is not the only reason that we have for celebrating this time of year. Many people in different traditions celebrate this time of year for different reasons. Whatever the reason might be, I think the general point is to get in touch with it. And more specifically, if you, like many, a large majority of Americans, I believe, celebrate Christmas at this time. And if that's the case, then let's remember this very brilliant and unique teacher of divine love and universal brotherhood and sisterhood, and that those were the two teachings, and very, very beautiful, universally applicable teachings, I think. So at any rate, I wanted to mention that today as a part of this greater message of Mercury Neptune, which again was inspired by my spiritual teacher's talk yesterday, which was very similar in nature in terms of getting to the core or essence of something, and of trying to understand why we do what we do, or why we say what we say, or why we think the way that we think. It takes extra contemplation. We have to give ourselves the time and space so that we can develop that kind of awareness. And Mercury Neptune can very much be about the overwhelm of information and the overwhelm of life and stuff, saying things that we don't really mean, taking things in data and information we don't know where it's coming from, persuading ourselves or others of things in a way that's more about our selfish greed or our selfish interest. These are all things that are implied by Mercury's square to Neptune, and we've been learning about them for a while with this greater retrograde cycle that started with that square. On the other hand, it's also a very good time, again, for kind of getting in touch with higher information, altered states of consciousness, meditation, contemplation, speaking fluidly and from the heart, having an insight or a perception that transcends the ordinary. And also messages that are special or unique for each person, for each moment. So just little sprawling thoughts here, some sprawling thoughts, I guess, true to Mercury Neptune, about Mercury Neptune. So the next thing that I want to talk about comes from a number of emails that I've gotten actually over like the past month. Were basically all the same in the sense that they were all asking me, or in some cases sort of debating around this thing, the soapbox that I tend to get on about not being identified with our birth charts. Now, there's conventional like language that we use, like my Mars, my Saturn, my Venus, my Moon, my birth chart, my 12th house, my stellium. Like, it's a lot of personal possessive language. And I've said numerous times in numerous videos that I've made and classes that I teach and stuff like that, that we should practice not using that language. But then I think sometimes people think, maybe well, what's the harm? Like, what? Certainly, every birth chart really is unique to us, and there is kind of a personal message in the birth chart. So what's the harm of using the personal possessive? And it's a great point. It's a great sort of counterpoint. And I think that I should qualify why I believe that it's important to not be overly identified with the birth chart, and why I emphasize practicing language around the birth chart that's not always using the personal possessives. So I want to clarify that today. So I wrote this, and I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it. I said, the point that we're trying to make by saying it's not your Saturn or your Mars, or even in a sense, your birth chart, is we're trying to help extricate people, ourselves as students of astrology or practitioners or our clients, from over identification with the chart. It's not that any identification with the birth chart is somehow evil or bad. That's not at all my point. I'm not trying to come across that in some rigid sense like that. It's not a languaging dogma that I'm advocating for, in other words. What I'm trying to say is that the chart really isn't ours, just as our body isn't ours. You know, it's temporary. And so we're here in it. It's like a temple that houses us, but it's not ours. The birth chart is not ours. The sky and the heaven is not ours. The land, the trees, or the earth, we don't really own it. We can't really possess it. Now, I know that on some level, someone might be like, okay, but conventionally I can be like, my chart, my Mars, my whatever. Like, why are you laboring this point? Let me try to explain this a little bit more. We don't really possess anything here. That's a spiritual truth that we're really trying to stay home with. And what we want to focus on is that the chart contains a message that is being spoken to us individually through the emissaries of the gods, the planets, the stars, the heavens. So it's a simple idea, not getting identified with the chart, not being too much about my Mars and my 12th house or my 10th house or whatever. What we're really trying to do is understand that the chart is oracular, and that the chart is filled with omens that are speaking to us. It's a message. It's a personal kind of message. What's really important is what we do with that message, not how we identify with it, not how we hold it and possess the message, but what we do, what we choose, how we live our lives based upon how we hear and receive the message of a birth chart. And there is a subtle difference. So here's an example that I came up with in this little piece that I wrote. So for example, Saturn in its fall in Aries in the 7th house, if that's where Saturn happens to be, isn't my Saturn. It's a message about relationships, 7th house of relationships, that I should take to heart and I should study carefully, so that I understand its teaching or its warning or its wisdom. Upon hearing this message from a trained astrologer, typically we're not the best at reading our own charts. We usually need some outside help. I should do my best to apply or act on that wisdom in my daily life. I don't want to be walking around telling everyone my message from my planetary teacher or my astrologer said to me that I will deal with troubles in my relationships because of my Saturn. So I'm really bummed because I've got a difficult Saturn. My Saturn is difficult, and I'm going to have to learn how to deal with my message that I've just gotten from my astrologer about my birth chart and my Saturn. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm really exaggerating, and no one's really that bad, of course. But in this case, we're getting identified with the problem. We're getting identified with the chart. We're getting identified with the planet. We're getting identified with the message, rather than taking it in, receiving it, and acting upon it, trying to raise or change or shift our consciousness. So I came up with this analogy. Imagine, for example, this is a way of thinking about the divinatory nature of astrology. Imagine that you approach a saintly person like Mother Teresa or the Dalai Lama or some great revered saint. This person is known and revered, imagine, by countless millions upon millions of people, similar to like a demigod. You approach this saint at a great temple gathering where many, many millions of people are in line to hear this saintly person's personal words of wisdom whispered into the ear. These little pieces of wisdom may be very short, they may be very cryptic, but very specific. They will act like a koan, like a Zen riddle, to be thought about and contemplated for many, many years as you struggle and work to enact the teachings or wisdom or warning or message that this saintly person whispers into your ear. This saintly person doesn't know you from anyone else in the crowd. You're not special to them, but on the other hand, you're not meaningless or unspecial to them. When you approach them, they whisper into your ear teachings about relationships, about violence and power struggles, about weakness and power in relationships, Saturn in its fall in the 7th house. The teaching that they offer you, right, it's not unique. It's actually a universal lesson that many, many people deal with. Just as the saintly person is known and revered by millions and millions of people because they're in an elevated state of consciousness and they have special wisdom, they have this special ability to speak like this to you. In fact, the teaching that this person, the saintly person, whispers into your ear is not what makes you unique either. It's actually how you respond to that teaching that makes you unique. Or put in a different way, the teaching has to do specifically with things that tend to keep you from being yourself as a spirit soul. So when you walk away, having received this message that's there to help enlighten you over the course of a long period of time, it's like a teaching you're going to contemplate over and over again in different ways. Imagine that you had really seen such a saintly person and received this kind of wisdom. Do you see how it would be problematic to say something like, well, my Dalai Lama told me that my message is a very difficult one that I have to go work on because my message is really a difficult, hard one from my Dalai Lama. Do you see what I'm saying? So like Saturn is like the Dalai Lama or is like a great teacher. Venus is like the Dalai Lama or like a great teacher, right? All the planets are sort of these semi-divine or divine gods. And the planets are said to be the emissaries or messengers or oracles or signs of the gods. And so when you go to their temples in a chart, so to speak, you're going into an oracular temple setting and you're receiving messages from these gods in the ancient world. You know, just think, everyone revered the gods and their messages as these beautiful divine powers that were speaking to us in the same way that if you went to a large gathering where 1 million people were waiting in line to receive a personal message from the Dalai Lama, you wouldn't think, well, that's my Dalai Lama, or this is my temple site, right? So the birth chart similarly, even though it's oriented to the time of your birth, you have to imagine that the birth chart is more like a temple that is common to everyone. It's a setting under the sky from a horizontal vantage point on the earth somewhere at a time somewhere. It is common to all. You're in a temple that is bigger than yourself. It's not your chart in that sense. And the teachers that are going to whisper something into your ears, they are teachers that are also common to everybody. And the message that's read, the astrologer, like the acolyte taking you through the temple, ushering you to hear the messages from the gods, they are a steward of this temple and of these messages. And they are for you, but they're not something to claim as yours, right? It's not like, imagine if you had such a sacred experience and you left the temple, right? And then you went out to everyone like, oh my gosh, when I was just in my temple and I got my message and it was so, it was so messed up, and like my message is such a difficult one, and I'm really dealing with the difficulty of my message, everyone would be like, all right, just, you know, like let's keep the experience sacred. It's not your message, right? It's take the message and go do something with it. That's the real takeaway. That's what we're trying to get at. So, and often enough, the messages of a birth chart, because you have to remember how birth charts were conceptualized, they were thought of as maps of the things that we are going to encounter in this material world. You could think of it as our karma, a lot of which we become overly identified and attached to, and it becomes a problematic barrier to staying home in the heart, where we're an eternal spiritual being that truly does not possess anything, truly is moving through this life, is in this world, but not of it. So, you know, again, this is why I talk about not using the personal possessive language too much. It's not, I mean, you can use it conventionally. It's not like, again, it's not to police the language. Instead, what we just need to have a light touch with how we understand a birth chart. What's also important to remember throughout the history of astrology, that oftentimes people had charts cast for their birth that were not set to the time of their birth, that were set to conception, that were set to birth, but that also would have been set to whenever you went and visited an astrologer, because you may not have had record of your birth time. So a birth chart truly is not, in a sense, there's a false sense that like, well, it's unique to your moment and your place and time of birth and da-da-da, and it's like just this hardwired, and say it couldn't be any other way. But no, because we have ample evidence from the history of astrology that astrologers might cast a chart for someone the moment that they walk in to see them, and just cast a chart like that if someone didn't have their birth information. So astrology, like tarot, I draw comparisons a lot because it helps us to keep a kind of better understanding of astrology. Tarot, you can, someone comes in and they have a child and they don't want to use a birth chart. They want to use a 12-card tarot spread. Say, could you cast 12 cards in a circular position and tell me something about their life? What will it be like, right? No one's saying, well, that's my spread, right? Or those are my cards, or any way that you would use the possessive would just be conventional. It would not be about some true sense of like, well, that's me. First and foremost, the divination is a message to you. It's a picture, but it's a message. It's what you do with the message of any reading that matters the most, not with how you identify with the message. And that's the subtle point, again, that we're trying to get at. So this is why I encourage people to try a period of time where we don't say my Saturn or my Venus. Rather, we say Venus in you could say my birth chart. I don't see such a problem with that. But you could say Venus in my birth chart is located in this house in this sign, and I understand it like this. Just trying to keep a sense of these as gods, as messengers, just as sacred as you would consider having received a message from the Dalai Lama. You'd great reverence, right, for giving autonomy and agency to these messages and messengers. That gives us the ability to really receive them as individuals as well. So I hope that helps. I hope that analogy, that picture, can kind of help you understand why we're really supposed to think of birth charts as the symbols of a birth chart are really a sort of medium through which divine intelligence is speaking something to us. And it's something that we're supposed to do something with, shifting our consciousness, changing our lives, working with the message that's given. Therefore, we want to be very careful that what we emphasize is, I'm a spirit soul and I have a life to live with messages that are coming to me from this oracle, not that like I'm working on my chart and my message and you know what I mean? We have to be careful not to get overly wrapped up in it. It's sort of like, if you get the message, hang up the phone, that classic quote from whoever it was, I think Tim Leary. If you get the message, hang up the phone. It's like, if something comes through the birth chart and teaches you something about your life, or gives you a message or a picture of the future or a warning or something like that, you say, thank you, put it aside, walk away. We don't really, astrology is something that we approach most of the time because of anxieties or problems or the need for guidance. Once we've received some insight, it's best to really have some healthy distance from it. So the study of astrology itself can be very dangerous in the sense that while we're learning, it's great to look at our own charts, right? Because it helps us to understand the material and the theory and the techniques and stuff like that. But it's really better to have other people look at your chart, and and not be overly obsessed with your own chart, because then you really kind of you can get in your head about it, and rather than receiving the message and going off and enacting it with some healthy kind of, it's like it's like not everyone's meant to live in the temple. Do you know what I mean? Like not everyone's ready to like live in an ashram. Some of us have to go to a spiritual place, a pilgrimage. We take the message, then we go back. We come off the mountain, we go and we live our lives and try to enact it. I think what's problematic is that a lot of times in modern astrology, because it's kind of, everything's sort of psychologized, then you start taking the study of astrology and saying, well, this is something that I have to like be engaged with my chart like all the time. And that really often doesn't give us the space to take the teachings of the chart and actually go and do something with them. So it's a danger, it's a risk that we run in terms of looking at our own charts all the time. And the other thing that we have to be careful of is, as students of astrology, the language of astrology itself, learning the language of astrology, is something that is universally applicable. When you look at charts of all different kinds, right, and you study the charts of so many different people and see the techniques at work, all of the messages that you get to read and understand coming through other people's charts are really messages for all of us. They're the teachings that are provided about fate and destiny and how we should act and behave in the world and carry ourselves and cultivate our spiritual lives. Any chart is really delivering the same kinds of messages. If you study them as an astrologer, the spiritual practice in some ways can become far less about your own chart and far more about just the general study of fate and fortune and the spiritual lessons that accompany. For ancient astrologers, your own nativity would have been, we have evidence that astrologers included understanding of their own nativity, and even in their own textbooks. But it still stands to reason, if you look at the philosophy that accompanied ancient astrology in the East and the West, that this was a more comprehensive study of fate and fortune in general, of the nature of change and of the ups and downs of life, such that we could learn by studying them not to get wrapped up in them. That's the ultimate message, really, of every chart. How do we go through this life being in this world but not of it, knowing that we'll slough off our body at some point? These kinds of things are the true insights that astrology delivers to us, no matter which chart you study. Again, so more reasons why we want to be careful not to get overly wrapped up in our chart, in my planets and my placements and my stelliums and all of that. That doesn't mean, however, at the end of the day, that you can't say my Mars or my Venus or whatever. It's really about the intention and the motivation and the consciousness behind why we're using the language in the way that we're using it. So I hope that makes sense. Really, I'm not trying to be dogmatic about it. I'm just trying to make a point because it's something that I see repeated in social media, in my classes, in emails that I receive year round. And it's something that, my own teachers have really taught me. And even when I was in India, I'll never forget, I spoke to an Indian astrologer, and this is an astrologer, right? And well, two stories when I was in India that just, I think because India's astrology has been practiced largely in the same manner, much more than it has in the West for thousands of years, you get a mood for how people relate to astrology there that's very different. It was very enlightening for me to be there last winter, and I'm returning this winter. So I'll tell you what a woman said to me. One time a woman asked me, she knew I was an astrologer, heard that I was an astrologer, and said, can you read my chart for me sometime or whatever? And I said, sure. And she got kind of nervous, and she said, I know that I don't have to look. I know that I could just trust God. I know that I don't have to look. She said, but I'm weak and my anxieties overcome me, and it helps me to not be so anxious to know something of what's to come. I found that that exact attitude, which is that is to me an attitude that I heard repeated in numerous occasions when I was in India, is probably more representative of what things were like in the ancient world, whether it's the gods or gods singular, monotheism or polytheism. Not the point here, just that there is, you approach an astrologer because of some anxiety, because your faith is troubled, because your sense of trust in the natural flow of life is being disturbed. And the astrologer, regardless of if they give you a good prognostication or a more difficult one or a message or a teaching or something like that, the point is that you go to an astrologer to reconcile with your anxiety about the future or with your anxiety about life. But that, again, it's the obsession with astrology would be an indication of someone who may have impure motivations or may be struggling with something that's a little neurotic. Now, take that or leave that. I'm not saying you have to agree with that, but I was really refreshed personally by that perspective, because as an astrologer who sees, upward of 1,000 clients sometimes in a year over the course of 10 years of doing this, this is something that I've personally come to in my own heart too. It's like I don't look at my chart that often, and because over time, the message, the more singular message of astrology, spiritually speaking, it presents itself more and more and more, which is, in a sense, the singular message is like, just trust, do the best you can. In a sense, it's sort of like Jesus's teachings: love God and love others, and just trust, just, go with it. And if you get anxious, if you're worried, if you want to understand something that you're confused about, then you can consult the oracle, and the message isn't about the outcome. The outcome and the message together are designed in a way to bring you back into your center. So it's not, even though it'll give you something about an outcome, it's really the way in which the prognostication is taught or received or given that tells us something that we need to know. So that's why it's called apotelesmatics, or the study of outcomes, because it's through studying outcomes and changes in the material world that we start to see something of transcendental value. All outcomes are teachings, and all teachings are about bringing us back to the heart, back to the center, back to the ground of our being. So, again, that's sort of. Then I had an astrologer. I said there's a woman who said this to me, and then similarly, I had an astrologer, and we were talking about our charts, and I said, "What is your chart like?" And the astrologer was like, "Just do not want to discuss my chart. Hands off of that. It's not." Almost like it was a bad luck. Like, let's just get that right out of the space. Don't. And that really left an impression on me. Here we are, some American astrologers going on and on about our charts. And this Indian astrologer, when asked to comment on his own, was utterly uninterested, utterly like, not important, not relevant. And that there was a privacy to that, which I really admire. And there was also a sacredness. It's sacred territory, and I'm very careful. I sort of take my shoes off if I go into that space. That's also what I'm trying to get at when I say being careful about the way we think and talk about the chart. So it's not that we can't look at our charts, not that we can't study our charts. It's not even that we can't use my Venus or my birth chart or whatever. It's really the motivation and the consciousness behind it all. So I hope that has come through loud and clear today. All right. Now, and again, like as always, these are the opinions of one practitioner. There are lots of practitioners out there who have different feelings, and you, as a student of astrology, may have your own feelings. And sometimes people seem to get upset that I have established views about things, as though it's fundamentally rigid to have a view. And I can't subscribe to that idea. Like, I believe that it's my right to have a view or a take on these matters. and to try to articulate it as thoughtfully as I can, and to try and teach people of the positions that I've come to, because I believe that they are true and valuable. So I believe other astrologers have the right to do that as well, and healthy debate can certainly happen. But some people have recently suggested that I really, like, you shouldn't have, like, literally received an email from someone not long ago that was like, you should just talk about what's going to happen and not try to use the astrology to talk about, your spiritual beliefs. And I was like, well, the problem with that, if I were to use this channel, for example, or any of my work, to just talk about outcomes, just talk about the astrology and what's going to happen, is that I would also be taking a philosophical position by virtue of taking a position that only focused on, like, well, here's where this planet is, here's where that planet is, here's what it could mean, and just no spiritual values or teachings to accompany it. Then that is also a philosophical position. Even if it seems to be the lack of one, you really can't in this life approach things without the background of your values and your beliefs shaping the way that you do things. And so I believe that at the end of the day, we all have a choice to make about what our beliefs are and what we value. And this goes back to the Mercury Neptune thing, really. I think it boils down to trying to understand the best of our abilities why we believe the things that we believe, why we do the things that we do. And so I'm very passionate about not just saying, here's what's going to happen in the planets, but also using all of my work as an opportunity to say why I think we're doing astrology. So I hope that this, again, was interesting for everybody. And I hope that you all have a very Merry Christmas if you celebrate. If you are taking in the holiday in a different way, then I hope that good spirits and good vibes accompany you. And I will be in touch with all of you after Christmas at this point. So take care and have a very blessed week. Bye.